Elias thought the cold would kill him first, or perhaps the starvation that made his belly cramp in knots. He was wrong. The thing that was actually going to kill him was his own pride, and the man watching him from the ridge knew it. The trapper sat beneath a skeleton of pine branches, his fingers black at the tips where the frost had worked its way into the meat. He'd lost his right mitten 2 days back when he'd tried to ford the creek, convinced the ice would hold. It hadn't. His rifle lay across his lap, powder horn empty, the last of his lead spent on a rabbit he'd missed by a clean foot. The rabbit had stopped, turned to look at him, then bounded off through snow that came up to Elias's knees, but barely seemed to trouble the animal at all. That was yesterday, or perhaps the day before. Time moved strangely when a man stopped moving. The wind came down from the north, steady and mean. It pushed through the pines and sent needles of ice against Elias's face. He'd wrapped his wool scarf around his head until only his eyes showed, but the scarf was stiff now, frozen with the vapor from his breath. Each inhale burned. Each exhale took something from him he couldn't get back. He was 23 years old, from Philadelphia, the son of an import merchant who'd sent him west with a letter of introduction and $200 in silver. The letter was in his coat pocket, rendered meaningless by geography and temperature. The silver was gone, traded for traps and provisions and the partnership with 2 men who'd seemed capable in the lamplight of the trading post, but had proven to be something else entirely when the first real snow came. They'd left him 3 days ago, taken the horses, the good furs, the tent, and most of the food. Left him his rifle and 20 rounds and a bedroll that was designed for autumn camping, not for the kind of cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. He'd woken to hoof prints in the snow and the sick understanding that he was alone in country that didn't care whether he lived or died. He'd started walking south. That was what a man did. Walked until he found civilization or until he stopped walking. But the snow was deep and his boots were eastern boots, made for cobblestone and carriage steps, and after the first day his feet had gone numb, and he'd learned that numb was better than the alternative. When the feeling came back, it came back as pain so sharp he'd gasped and nearly vomited. So he'd stopped, found this place where 3 pines grew close together and offered something like shelter, built a fire with the last of his matches in hands that shook so badly he'd nearly wept with frustration. The fire had burned for perhaps an hour before the wind killed it. He'd tried to restart it with flint and steel, but his fingers wouldn't work properly, and the sparks died in the snow, and after a while he'd simply stopped trying. That was when he'd seen the man on the ridge. A figure, dark against the white sky, motionless, watching. Elias had blinked, certain it was a trick of exhaustion or the cold playing games with his eyes. But when he looked again, the figure remained. Too far to make out details, but close enough that Elias could see it was a man. Could see the man was watching him. His first thought had been rescue. His second thought, coming fast behind the first, had been fear. He knew where he was. Dakota Territory. Sioux country. The men at the trading post had spoken about the tribes with a mixture of respect and wariness, and Elias had listened with the careful attention of someone who'd read newspaper accounts of massacres and midnight raids. The stories were confused and contradictory. Some said the Indians were noble and peaceful. Others said they were savages who killed for sport. Elias, who'd never seen an Indian except for one drunk Potawatomi sleeping behind a warehouse in St. Louis, had split the difference and decided to be cautious. But caution required energy, and Elias had none to spare. He'd simply sat beneath his pines and watched the figure watching him, and after a long while the figure had moved. Not toward Elias, but along the ridge, parallel to him, matching his position but maintaining the distance, following him. Elias had gripped his rifle, had thought about the empty powder horn, had understood with perfect clarity that if the man on the ridge meant him harm, there was nothing Elias could do to prevent it. Still, he'd forced himself to stand, had gathered his bedroll and his empty pack and had started walking again, south and east, toward where he believed the settlements lay. His feet screamed with each step. The pain was enormous and particular, centered in his toes where the black frost had worked deepest. He'd looked down once and seen his right boot was leaking a clear fluid that froze into small beads on the leather. The figure had followed, staying on the high ground, never closing the distance but never falling behind. Elias had walked until dark, then collapsed in a hollow where the wind was slightly less cruel. He'd pulled the bedroll over himself and lain shivering, too cold to sleep but too exhausted to stay awake. His mind had wandered through memories that felt distant and false. His father's house, the smell of his mother's kitchen, a girl named Margaret who'd let him kiss her once behind the church and who'd written him a letter he'd lost somewhere between St. Louis and Fort Pierre. He'd thought about dying, not with fear but with a kind of academic interest. The cold would take him in his sleep, they said, a peaceful way to go. Better than the wolves or the Indians or falling through ice into black water. But he'd woken when the first light came, gray and thin, and realized he hadn't died. His body still functioned, after a fashion. His heart still beat. His lungs still pulled in the bitter air. And the man was still there, closer now. Close enough that Elias could make out details. He wore furs. Not the ragged hides of a white trapper, but proper winter clothing, layered and purposeful. His hair hung in 2 braids wrapped with what looked like red cloth. His face was dark, not from dirt, but from heritage, and even at this distance Elias could see the calm in his posture. The man sat on a paint horse, the animal's breath steaming in the cold, and he held a rifle across his lap in a manner that suggested absolute competence. Elias had felt his stomach drop, had thought about the stories, about scalpings and torture and the things men did to other men when there were no laws, but the laws they made themselves. He'd started moving. Not south anymore but east, toward rougher country where the pines grew thick and a man might lose a pursuer. His feet barely worked. Each step was a negotiation between will and flesh. But fear was a powerful thing, stronger even than cold or pain, and it drove him forward. The horseman had adjusted his course, still following, still maintaining that careful distance. And now, 2 days later, Elias understood the truth of his situation. He was going to die. The cold would take him, or the starvation would, or the wolves he'd heard last night, singing in the darkness. But before any of that, his pride would kill him. Because instead of stopping, instead of turning to face the man who followed him, instead of risking contact with another human being who might help him or might kill him, Elias kept walking, kept fleeing, kept making the choice that felt safe but was leading him deeper into country that would not forgive mistakes. The man on the ridge knew this. Elias could feel it, could sense in the patience of that pursuit that the horseman understood exactly what Elias was doing and why. Could see that Elias was not running toward safety but away from it, driven by fear and ignorance into country that would finish what the cold had started. And still Elias walked. South, east, anywhere but toward the man who watched him. His vision had started to narrow, tunneling down to just the ground in front of him, the next step and the next. His thoughts came slowly, thick and confused. He didn't see the tracks until he nearly stepped in them, large, splayed, paw prints as wide as his hand, pressed deep into the snow. A trail of them, coming from the west and heading in the same direction Elias was walking. Wolf tracks, fresh. Elias stopped, turned in a slow circle. The forest was silent except for the wind. The tracks crossed his own trail and continued on. And when Elias looked more carefully, he saw there were more. Many more. A pack moving together, their trail braiding in and out of the trees. He looked up at the ridge. The horseman was gone. The absence of the horseman was somehow worse than his presence had been. Elias stood in the trampled snow where the wolf pack had passed and felt a new species of fear work its way into his chest. At least the man had been predictable, had maintained his distance and his watchful silence. The wolves were something else. They were hunger made animate, and they moved through this country like they owned it. Because they did. Elias started walking again, faster now despite the agony in his feet. The tracks paralleled his course for perhaps 100 yards before diverging into the timber. He told himself this was good. Told himself the pack was hunting something else, following some scent that had nothing to do with him. But he knew better. He'd read enough, heard enough stories from the trappers in the trading posts. Wolves didn't waste energy. They were efficient killers, and a lone man stumbling through deep snow with the smell of fear on him would register as prey. Easy prey. The trees pressed closer. Elias had left the open country behind without meaning to, driven by his panicked flight from the horsemen into this maze of deadfall and dense pine. The snow was shallower here where the canopy blocked some of the fall, but the going was harder. Branches caught at his coat. Roots hidden beneath the white surface tried to trip him. He fell twice, the second time landing on his rifle hard enough that he felt something in his ribs give way with a sound like green wood snapping. The pain was immediate and huge. He rolled onto his back, gasping, each breath a lesson in what breaking felt like. When he finally got to his feet, his right side had gone stiff, and something ground against itself deep in his chest when he moved. He kept walking. The light was failing. That happened early this far north, the sun giving up its fight with winter by mid-afternoon. The shadows between the trees went from gray to blue to something darker. Elias had no plan beyond movement, no destination beyond away from the wolves, away from the horsemen, away from anything that might kill him, as if distance alone could save him. He smelled smoke. The scent stopped him in his tracks. Wood smoke, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere ahead and to his left. His first instinct was relief so powerful it made him dizzy. A camp, people. Help. His second instinct was caution. He moved toward the smoke slowly, rifle held across his chest despite its uselessness. The trees thinned, and he found himself on the edge of a small clearing. No camp, no fire. Just a stone outcropping with a shallow cave beneath it, and in the cave's mouth a small fire burned, contained and nearly smokeless. The horseman's paint was tied to a tree at the clearing's edge, blanket still on its back. The saddle sat on a log near the fire, the leather dark with age and use. A bedroll lay spread on the driest part of the cave floor. But no horseman. Elias stood at the tree line and felt his hands start to shake. This was a trap. Had to be. The man had set this out like bait and was waiting somewhere in the trees for Elias to step into the clearing, to commit himself. Then the rifle shot or the knife or whatever method these people used. He took a step back. His boot found a branch hidden under the snow, and it cracked with a sound like a pistol shot. The paint horse raised its head and looked directly at him. The animal showed no alarm, just a kind of calm assessment, and after a moment went back to nosing at the base of the tree where something edible might be hidden under the snow. Elias waited, watched the clearing, watched the trees. Saw nothing. The cold was seeping into him through his clothes. He'd stopped sweating hours ago, which he understood dimly was a bad sign. His body was shutting down, conserving what it could, abandoning the extremities to save the core. His fingers had gone from black to gray, and he couldn't feel them anymore, even when he pressed them against his palms. The fire burned in the cave mouth, small, controlled, warm. He took a step into the clearing, then another. The paint watched him but didn't move. No rifle shot came from the trees. No figure materialized from the shadows. Elias reached the fire and nearly fell into it. He got his hands out in front of him just in time, felt the heat against his frozen fingers, and then the pain started as blood tried to force its way back into dying tissue. He made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and pulled his hands back. The bedroll smelled of wood smoke and horse, and something else, some scent he couldn't identify. Animal fat maybe, or leather oil. He touched it with one ruined hand and felt how dry it was, how well made. Not white man's work. This was something older, something that came from a tradition of living outside in all seasons. On the log next to the saddle sat a leather pouch. Elias opened it with shaking hands and found pemmican. The dried meat and berries and fat were pressed into small cakes, each one wrapped in thin hide. He took one and bit into it and felt his stomach cramp at the sudden presence of food. He forced himself to chew slowly, to let the rich fat melt on his tongue before swallowing. He ate 3 of the cakes. Knew he was stealing but couldn't stop himself. Each one was a small miracle, dense with calories and life. When he looked up, the horseman was standing at the edge of the clearing. Elias scrambled backward, dropping the pouch, his hand going to his rifle before he remembered it was empty. The horseman didn't move, didn't raise his own rifle or make any threatening gesture. He simply stood there, 20 feet away, and watched Elias with the same patient intensity he'd shown for the past 3 days. Elias could see his face clearly now in the firelight. Older than Elias had thought, perhaps 40, with lines around his eyes and mouth that spoke of long days in sun and wind. His cheekbones were high and sharp. His eyes were dark and showed nothing. His rifle was a percussion cap model, well maintained, and he held it with the casual competence of someone who'd been carrying weapons since childhood. They stared at each other across the clearing. Elias's heart hammered in his chest. His broken ribs sent spikes of pain through his torso with each beat. The horseman looked at the pemmican pouch on the ground, looked at Elias. Then, with movements that were almost lazy in their lack of concern, he walked to the fire and sat down cross-legged on the opposite side of the flames. He didn't look at Elias again. Instead, he pulled a small leather bag from inside his coat and began working at something with his hands. Elias couldn't see what. The man's back was to the firelight, and his fingers moved in shadow. Minutes passed. The fire crackled. The paint horse stamped and shifted its weight. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the clearing, something moved through the brush with a sound like water over stones. Elias realized he was holding his breath and let it out in a shaking exhale. The horseman didn't react. Didn't seem to care that Elias was there at all. Finally, Elias forced himself to move. He picked up the pemmican pouch and held it out toward the fire, toward the horseman. An offering. An apology. The horseman glanced at the pouch, nodded once, then went back to his work. Elias set the pouch down next to the fire and retreated to the cave's edge where the bedroll lay. He sat on the stone floor and pulled his coat tight around himself. His feet throbbed. His ribs sent sharp messages with each breath. But the fire's heat was reaching him now, and he could feel his body trying to respond, trying to warm itself, trying to live. He watched the horseman work. Eventually he could see what the man was doing. He was making bullets, measuring powder from a horn, wrapping the lead in small patches of cloth, working with an economy of motion that spoke of thousands of repetitions. He made 6 bullets and set them in a neat row on the log next to him. Then he loaded his rifle with the same careful precision, measuring twice, ramming the charge home with a rod he cleaned after each use. When he was finished, he set the rifle across his knees and looked across the fire at Elias. Elias met his eyes, tried to think of what to say, how to communicate, how to express gratitude or ask questions or explain himself, but no words came. His throat was too dry, his mind too scattered. The horseman reached into his coat again and pulled out another leather pouch. He tossed it across the fire, and it landed in the snow near Elias's feet. Elias opened it and found more pemmican. A dozen cakes, enough to keep a man alive for days. He looked up. The horseman was standing now, rifle in hand. He gestured toward the east with his chin. The motion was small but clear. That direction. That's where you need to go. Then he walked to his horse and swung up into the saddle with a grace that made it look effortless. He turned the paint toward the trees and stopped, looking back at Elias one more time. Elias raised a hand. The horseman nodded. Then he rode into the darkness and was gone. Elias slept that night. Real sleep, deep and dreamless, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion now that it had food and warmth. When he woke, the fire had burned down to coals, but the cave still held some heat. Dawn was breaking outside, gray and cold but clear. He forced himself to eat more pemmican. His stomach protested, but he kept the food down. Then he examined his feet and immediately wished he hadn't. The toes on his right foot were black clear to the nail beds, the flesh hard and dead. His left foot was better, but not by much. 3 toes were gray and weeping fluid. The smell was bad. He rewrapped them as best he could with strips torn from his extra shirt. The shirt was cotton, inadequate for bandages but better than nothing. When he tried to stand, the pain was so intense his vision went white at the edges. He sat back down hard and breathed through his nose until the world steadied. He couldn't stay here. The cave was shelter, but it wasn't safety. He needed to reach the settlements. Needed real help, a doctor, proper treatment. The alternative was to lose the foot. Or worse. He gathered his things. The bedroll stayed where it was, the horseman's property. But Elias took the pemmican and his rifle and his pack. When he emerged from the cave, the morning sun was just clearing the trees, and the temperature had dropped further with the clear sky. His breath came out in clouds so thick they looked solid. He started walking east as the horseman had indicated. The direction made sense. East was the Missouri River, and along the river were the settlements, Fort Pierre, the trading posts, civilization. The going was brutal. His feet were stones of pain with each step. The broken rib made breathing an exercise in finding the least agonizing depth and rhythm. But he walked and kept walking, and after a while the pain became just another fact of existence, no more remarkable than the cold or the snow. He didn't see the wolves until midday. They were ahead of him, 5 of them, moving through the trees in single file. They weren't running or hunting, just traveling with the ground-eating trot that could cover enormous distances. The lead wolf was huge, bigger than any dog Elias had ever seen, with a coat the color of smoke. The others were smaller but no less impressive, all lean muscle and winter fur. Elias froze. The wolves passed no more than 50 yards in front of him and gave no indication they'd noticed his presence. When they were gone, he stood shaking in the silence they left behind. An hour later he found the deer carcass. It lay in a small depression where the wind had carved the snow into drifts. The wolves had been thorough. The rib cage was cracked open and cleaned, the organs gone, the meat stripped down to scraps. The head remained, one dead eye staring at the sky. Elias circled the kill site, studying the tracks. The wolves had come from the west, taken down the deer here, fed, and then moved on toward the east. The same direction Elias was traveling. He looked back the way he'd come. The forest was silent. No sign of the horseman. He kept walking. The tracks multiplied as the day wore on. Not just the pack he'd seen, but others. The snow was written with the passage of wolves, dozens of them, all moving in the same general direction, converging. Elias began to understand that he'd walked into something. Some event or circumstance that had drawn these animals together. He thought about turning back, trying another route, but when he looked behind him, he saw only the deep snow and the darkening sky and the knowledge that he'd never make it back to the cave before nightfall. Forward was the only option. The sun was setting when he heard the sound. A long rising howl that started low and climbed to a note that seemed to vibrate in his chest. Then another voice joined it, and another, until the forest was full of their singing. They were close. Very close. Elias climbed. There was a small rise to his right, the ground rocky and steep, and he scrambled up it using his hands when his feet wouldn't hold. At the top he found a cluster of boulders that formed a rough semicircle. He wedged himself into the largest gap and pulled his rifle across his chest and waited. The wolves appeared as the last light faded. They came from everywhere and nowhere, materializing from the trees like smoke made solid. Dozens of them. More than Elias could count. They moved through the forest below him with a purpose that was almost businesslike. Not hunting but traveling, and within minutes the forest was alive with their passing. Elias pressed himself deeper into the rocks and tried not to breathe. The wolves paid him no attention. They were focused on something else, something ahead, and they flowed past his position like water around a stone. Then he saw what they were following. The horsemen rode through the pack as if they were sheep instead of predators. His paint horse walked calmly, unconcerned by the wolves that passed within feet of its hooves. The horseman sat straight-backed in his saddle, rifle across his lap, and Elias could see his head turning left and right as he counted the animals. Tracking them? No, not tracking, leading. The realization came to Elias with the force of revelation. The horseman wasn't following Elias, had never been following Elias. He was tracking the wolves, using Elias, whether intentionally or not, to draw them out, to see where they were going. And now Elias could see where that was. Ahead, perhaps a mile distant, smoke rose from what had to be a village. The thin gray columns were scattered across a valley where the trees gave way to open ground. Elias couldn't see the structures from this angle, but the smoke was unmistakable. Homes, people, the horseman's people. The wolves were heading straight for it. The horseman spurred his horse into a trot, moving ahead of the pack now, and Elias watched him disappear into the gathering dark. The wolves followed, their singing rising and falling, and within minutes the forest was empty again. Elias sat in his stone shelter and understood. The man hadn't been hunting him, hadn't been planning to kill him or rob him. He'd been trying to protect his village from the pack, and Elias, stumbling through the wilderness leaving a trail of fear and desperation, had been the perfect bait to track them. Had the horseman been protecting Elias too, leaving the food and the shelter and the clear directions? Or had Elias just been useful? It didn't matter. What mattered was that somewhere ahead a village was about to be attacked by more wolves than Elias had ever imagined could gather in one place, and the horseman was riding into it alone. Elias looked at his rifle, at his frozen hands, at his ruined feet. He thought about Philadelphia, about warm houses and cobblestone streets, and a world where predators came in human form and could be reasoned with, or bought off or avoided. Then he stood, gasping at the pain, and started climbing down from his shelter. Elias woke to the sound of women singing. The sound was soft and rhythmic, rising and falling in a pattern that felt older than words. He opened his eyes and saw a hide ceiling above him, the skin stretched tight and sewn with careful stitches. Smoke rose from a fire at the lodge's center and escaped through the smoke hole at the peak. An old woman sat beside him. She was working on his feet with hands that moved with absolute confidence. The smell of herbs was strong, and when Elias looked down he saw his feet were wrapped in poultices held in place with strips of soft leather. He tried to sit up. The old woman pushed him back down with one hand, surprisingly strong, and made a sound that was clearly a command to stay still. So he stayed still. The days that followed blurred together. The old woman changed his bandages twice daily. She fed him a thin broth that tasted of meat and roots and something bitter he couldn't identify. She sang while she worked, the same songs the other women sang, and gradually Elias began to recognize patterns in the melodies. His feet began to heal, not completely. He would lose 2 toes on the right foot. The old woman made clear through gestures and drawings in the ash of the fire. But the rest could be saved if he was careful, if he didn't try to walk too soon, if he let the medicine do its work. The horseman came to see him once. He appeared in the lodge entrance on the 3rd day and stood there for a long moment, studying Elias with that same patient intensity. Then he nodded and left. That night Elias was moved to a different lodge, one at the village's edge where a fire burned and food was laid out on a woven mat. A young woman brought him venison stew and bread made from some grain he didn't recognize. She didn't speak, but she smiled when he tried to thank her. He was a guest now, not a patient. The distinction was important. On the 7th day, the horseman came again. This time he carried Elias's rifle, cleaned and oiled, and a new powder horn. He set them next to Elias's bedroll and then produced a rolled hide from inside his coat. The hide was a map. The horseman spread it on the ground and pointed to marks burned into the leather. A river, mountains, specific landmarks. He traced a route with one finger, starting from a mark that Elias understood was this village and ending at another mark downstream, Fort Pierre, the settlement. The horseman tapped the route. Then he gestured to himself, to his chest. "I will take you." Elias shook his head, pointed to his feet. "I can't walk." The horseman's expression didn't change. He pointed outside the lodge. Elias pulled himself upright, using a lodge pole for support, and limped to the entrance. Outside, the paint horse stood with a travois attached to its saddle. The travois was made of 2 long poles with hides stretched between them, a simple but effective conveyance. For him. Elias turned to the horseman, tried to find words. Couldn't. What did a man say to someone who had saved his life not once but repeatedly? Who had killed a monster to protect his village and the arrogant fool who'd stumbled into the middle of it? Who was now offering to spend days guiding that fool to safety? The horseman seemed to understand Elias's silence. He touched his fingers to his chest, then pointed them at Elias, the same gesture he'd made before, respect. Then he gripped Elias's shoulder, the pressure firm but not aggressive, and guided him back into the lodge. They left 3 days later. Elias on the travois, his rifle and pack secured beside him, wrapped in furs against the cold. The old woman came to see him off. She pressed something into his hand, a small leather pouch that smelled of the herbs she'd used in her medicine. She spoke to him in her language, words he didn't understand but whose meaning was clear. "Take care of yourself." The horseman mounted his paint and they started east, following the route he'd shown on the hide map. The village watched them go, people emerging from lodges to raise hands in farewell. Children ran alongside for a short distance before falling back. They traveled for 5 days. The horseman set a steady pace, neither rushed nor slow, and each night he built a proper shelter and a contained fire. He shared his food without hesitation. He checked Elias's feet each morning, examining the healing tissue with the same careful attention the old woman had shown. They never spoke. But on the 3rd day, when they stopped to rest the horse, Elias worked up the courage to try. He pointed at himself. "Elias." The horseman looked at him, long enough that Elias thought he would simply ignore the overture. Then he pointed to his own chest. "Chaska." The name hung in the air between them. Elias repeated it, trying to get the pronunciation right. Chaska nodded, something that might have been approval in his eyes. They didn't exchange more words than that, but it was enough. On the 5th day, they crested a ridge and Elias saw the Missouri River below them, gray and wide and half frozen, and on its banks the scattered buildings of Fort Pierre, civilization. The word felt strange in his mind now, loaded with meanings he hadn't considered before. Chaska stopped the travois on the ridge. He dismounted and began unfastening the poles from his saddle. When Elias tried to help, he waved him back. Within minutes, the travois was disassembled and the poles laid on the ground. Chaska helped Elias off the hide carrier and steadied him while he found his balance. His feet hurt but held. The old woman's medicine had worked better than Elias had dared hope. Chaska pointed to the fort. Pointed to Elias, "Your people, your home." Elias looked at the settlement. Looked back at Chaska. The horseman was already gathering the travois poles, already preparing to leave. Elias took off one of his gloves. His hands were still bandaged but healing. He extended the bare hand to Chaska. The horseman looked at the hand, at Elias's face. Then he gripped Elias's hand in his own, the clasp firm and brief. He mounted his paint, turned the horse toward the west, and rode away without looking back. Elias stood on the ridge and watched until horse and rider disappeared into the vast white landscape. Then he turned toward Fort Pierre and started walking, using his rifle as a cane. Each step a small victory over the cold and the pride that had nearly killed him. He would survive, would heal, would eventually make his way back to Philadelphia with a story he suspected no one would believe. But he would remember the horseman who had tracked a monster to protect his people, who had saved a fool because it was the right thing to do, without expecting thanks or payment or even acknowledgement, Who had taught Elias, in the silence of the winter wilderness, that survival had nothing to do with where a man was from, or the color of his skin, or the language he spoke, and everything to do with respect for the land and the people who knew how to live in it. The lesson was hard won, but Elias carried it with him, along with his scars, down from the ridge toward the settlement, and whatever came next. The land made no distinctions. Neither should he. The descent nearly killed him. His feet had no feeling left, and twice he missed his footing and slid, catching himself on rocks that tore his palms even through the wool of his gloves. When he reached the bottom, his hands were bleeding, and his broken rib had shifted again with a grinding sensation that made him retch. But he walked east, toward the smoke, toward the wolves, toward something he didn't understand but couldn't ignore. The forest opened onto a broad valley just as full dark descended. Elias could see the village now, perhaps 40 structures scattered along a frozen stream. Most were hide lodges, conical and sturdy, smoke rising from the peaks. A few horses stood in a rope corral. Dogs barked in the distance. The wolves surrounded the village in a loose ring, staying just beyond the firelight. Elias could see their eyes reflecting the flames, dozens of green-gold points in the darkness. They paced and circled but didn't attack, waiting. The horseman sat on his paint at the village's eastern edge, alone, between the wolves and the homes. Other figures moved in the village, people carrying weapons, but they stayed close to the lodges, protecting the children. Elias understood. Letting the horseman handle this. Trusting him. Elias started down the slope toward the valley floor. His rifle was empty, but he carried it anyway, some instinct telling him that to arrive unarmed would be to invite an attack. The wolves noticed him immediately, heads turned. Several broke from the circle and started toward him with that fluid trot. Elias stopped. The wolves stopped. They sat in the snow 30 feet away and watched him with eyes that showed no emotion at all. Just calculation. He kept walking. The wolves let him pass. He didn't understand why and didn't question it. He just moved toward the horseman, who had turned in his saddle and was watching Elias approach. When Elias reached the village's edge, the horseman gestured sharply. "Stay back." The message was clear even without words. Elias ignored it. He walked to where the horseman sat and stood next to the paint horse. Up close he could see the tension in the man's posture, the way his fingers rested on his rifle's trigger guard. The horseman looked down at him, then at Elias's feet, at the blood seeping through the makeshift bandages. Back to Elias's face. Elias pointed at the wolves, then at himself, then at the horseman. "We're in this together." That was what he tried to communicate. The horseman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A kind of grim acknowledgement. He pointed at the center of the wolf pack, at a gap in their circle where the darkness seemed thicker. Elias looked and saw nothing at first, then movement. Something large, moving with a gait that was wrong somehow. Too low, too heavy, not a wolf. The creature that emerged from the tree line was massive. It walked on 4 legs, but barely, its shoulders hunched and deformed. One front leg held at an angle that spoke of old injury. Its head was too large for its body, the muzzle scarred and twisted. And its eyes. Its eyes burned with a light that had nothing to do with reflection. A wolf. Once. But something had happened to it. Disease or injury, or just the accumulated damage of too many winters had warped it into something else. Something that couldn't hunt properly anymore, couldn't run with the pack, couldn't survive in the normal way, so it had learned to hunt easier prey. It had learned to hunt people. The pack gave it room. They didn't fear it, but they didn't trust it either. This was the thing they'd been following. This was what the horseman had been tracking. The creature moved toward the village with a shambling gait. It ignored the healthy wolves, ignored Elias, focused entirely on the lodges and the smell of meat and smoke and humans. The horseman raised his rifle. Elias saw his finger tighten on the trigger. The shot would miss. Elias knew it with sudden certainty. The light was wrong, the distance too far, the creature moving unpredictably. And the horseman only had one shot before he'd need to reload, and reloading took time they didn't have. Elias stepped forward. He raised his empty rifle and aimed at the creature. His hands shook, his vision blurred. But he sighted down the barrel and tracked the thing's movement. The creature saw him, turned toward this new threat. Its mouth opened and showed teeth that were broken and yellow and enormous. It charged. The horseman's rifle cracked. The shot went wide, exactly as Elias had known it would, the ball kicking up snow 3 feet to the creature's left. The horseman immediately began reloading, his hands moving with desperate precision. But the creature was covering the distance in huge, lurching bounds. Elias stood his ground. He kept his rifle raised, tracking the creature's head, and when it was 20 feet away, he squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell on an empty chamber with a dry click. The creature launched itself at Elias, leaving the ground in a leap that carried it through the air like something launched from a catapult. Elias saw its jaws opening, saw the firelight glinting on those ruined teeth, and then something hit him from the side with tremendous force. The horseman had left his saddle in a diving tackle that knocked Elias clear. They hit the ground together, and Elias felt his broken rib finally snap completely, the pain so bright and all-consuming that he couldn't breathe or think or do anything but exist in that moment of perfect agony. The creature landed where Elias had been standing. It spun with a speed that seemed impossible for something so malformed and went for the horseman, who was rolling to his feet with a knife now in his hand. The blade was short and curved and looked very old. The horseman ducked under the creature's first lunge and drove the knife into its shoulder. The blade went into the hilt and came out red. The creature screamed, a sound that was nothing like a wolf howl, and turned on him with its jaws snapping. The horseman danced backward. He was faster than the creature, but not by much, and each near miss was a question of inches. He slashed again, opening a line across the thing's muzzle, and the creature's response was to charge straight at him, regardless of the pain. Elias got to his feet. His rifle was gone, lost in the tackle, but his hand found a rock half the size of his fist. He threw it with everything he had left. The rock hit the creature in its injured shoulder. The impact was nothing, would barely have hurt a healthy animal, but the creature's balance was already compromised, and the blow spun it just enough that its charge missed the horseman by a hair's breadth. The horseman used the opening. He stepped in close and drove his knife up under the creature's jaw, through the soft palate, into the brain. The creature dropped like a puppet with cut strings. It twitched once, twice, and then went still. The horseman stood over it, breathing hard, knife still buried in its skull. He put a foot on the thing's head and levered the blade free. Blood steamed in the cold air. The pack of healthy wolves had watched the entire fight without moving. Now they began to disperse, melting back into the forest in ones and twos. Within minutes they were gone, their purpose fulfilled, the thing they'd been following dead. The horseman cleaned his blade on the creature's fur and sheathed it. Then he walked to where Elias had collapsed in the snow and crouched beside him. Elias looked up at him. Tried to speak, couldn't find the air. The horseman studied him for a long moment. Then he stood and gave a short whistle. 2 young men emerged from the nearest lodge and came at his signal. The horseman gestured to Elias, gave instructions Elias couldn't understand, and the young men lifted him as carefully as they could. The world spun. Elias felt himself being carried, saw firelight and hide walls and smoke, and then he was lying on something soft in a space that was warm and smelled of sage and wood smoke. The horseman appeared above him one more time. He looked at Elias's feet, at his broken body, and his expression was grave. He touched 2 fingers to his chest, then pointed those same fingers at Elias. Respect. That was what the gesture meant. Then he turned and walked out into the night.